In 1959, master of gimmicks William Castle made the supernatural horror film House on Haunted Hill. It starred horror extraordinaire Vincent Price in the lead role and was meant to be a satire of the old dark house trope famous in the 20s and 30s. Well, many years later, Joel Silver, Robert Zemeckis, and Gilbert Adler formed the production company Dark Castle Entertainment. It was meant to homage William Castle's films and planned on remaking many of his famous projects, starting with a remake of House on Haunted Hill. However, after the remake of 13 Ghosts, this was eventually abandoned and they went on to produce many schlockfests and bargain bin crap like Ghost Ship, House of Wax, The Apparition, Bullet to the Head, and plenty of others. They also tried to supply a gimmick with each film, much like William Castle did, and with House on Haunted Hill, people had a chance to win actual money, much like the characters in the film. Unsurprisingly, this was also abandoned. House on Haunted Hill was released in 1999. Going into this, I only knew some of the content of the original film and a vague idea of the events that transpire. I eventually watched the remake and noticed some things that were very interesting. With that, this was the only remake that I watched this month where I hadn't seen the original before watching the remake, but afterwards I went out of my way to seeing the original. Partly because I had always wanted to see it, partly because it's public domain and I can watch it much easier, but mainly for another reason I'll get into a bit later. I liked the original. It was a good satirical view of the old dark house trope, which had grown tired since that time. But William Castle made sure to make it unique and interesting. It's a movie you shouldn't take too seriously, and I think that's why so many people hated the remake. They took it too seriously. In reality, House on Haunted Hill is not only a great remake, but a great movie that understood what made William Castle and his movies so famous and beloved. The last reason that I wanted to see the original before writing this review is that the way that the filmmakers made this movie work, and so well, was have it be a satire of the original film. Castle's movie was a satire, so they made it so this one was as well. But it's never insulting to the original film, and I find it to be very similar to the movie Galaxy Quest, where it makes fun of the content it's satirizing, but it also celebrates it. Ironically, both came out the same year. I think on its own, it does work. The characters were all distinguishable and likable, to an extent. The story was actually really interesting, and there were plenty of great twists and turns that were similar to the original film, but also had its own twists to shock the viewer. Now, I'm kinda about to spoil both films, so if you haven't seen either, I highly recommend both and watching them back to back. So, with the original film, it's all revealed that the whole thing was a farce set up by Frederick's wife Annabelle and Dr. Trent, her secret lover. But they get their comeuppance from Frederick and the movie soon ends. But with this, it's revealed that the idea of ghosts was not real and everything was explained by Trent and Annabelle pulling tricks on people. It was set up to be real and it turned out to be fake. Well, in the remake, it's vice versa. It's set up to be fake and it ends up being real. That there are really ghosts that haunt the house on Haunted Hill. Everything is set up from the get go that Stephen Price, this version's Frederick Loren, played by Jeffrey Rush, is not an ambiguous doctor like in the original film, but got his millions through gimmicks and instilling fear in his amusement parks. New ways to spike the adrenaline of the people riding his rides. While the name of the character is an obvious reference to the original's actor, Vincent Price, I feel like the character and personality of Stephen in actuality was an homage to William Castle. For example, early in the film, when Price is showing off his new roller coaster, he takes a reporter and her cameraman up into an elevator to get onto the ride. It appears to start breaking down and they begin falling, but it reveals to be a trick by Price to pump up the adrenaline and fear in his parkgoers before they actually ride the ride, which also has a fake car going off the rails to further his gimmick. Now, if you don't know who William Castle is, how you got so far into this review is beyond me. He was very famous for using contraptions and gimmicks in his movies and in the theaters to make his films unique and bring in more moviegoers. House on Haunted Hill was no exception, as when it played in theaters, a skeleton came down from the ceiling and flew over the audience in the final moments of the film. With that, in the remake, the whole idea of Price setting up the party and using various things to scare his guests is debunked before the actual scares start showing up through Price's wife, Evelyn Stockard Price, played by Famke Jensen. That's the thing I found so interesting about this movie, that even before watching the original, I felt that it was satirizing the original film and what Castle was known for, but still celebrating him. I really liked that about this movie. I felt that it was very clear that the writers, producers, and the director as well loved or were at least inspired by Castle, and through that, we got a great homage with a lot of heart. It's kind of similar to Fright Night in the way that it was different enough to do its own thing, but also similar enough to actually call it a remake. One more thing though. Remember how I said that the Scream franchise is so drenched in 90s that it's hard for me to take seriously, and there was another film that did it better? Well, this is that movie. The original movie was such a product of the cheesy horror movies made in the 50s that the datedness kinda works for the remake. Plus, it doesn't go so far that it makes me dislike it or is uncomfortable to watch. Although the thing at the end is a pretty dated effect. But outside of that, it works for the film. Overall, despite it working on its own as a fun and cheesy horror flick with some good acting, a genuinely interesting story, and some good practicals and lore, it also works as a satirization of the original film without being mean or disgracing Castle's legacy. I definitely think it's worth a rewatch if you saw it before and hated it. Plus, despite his small role, Jeffrey Combs is always a win.